Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest webinar in our Bringing Water to Life webinar series. My name is John Farner. I'm the Government Public Affairs Director with the Irrigation Association. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to do things a little bit different today. A couple of things. If you hear one of our speakers noise in the background because he is on the road right now. So I want to go through a couple different things that we have right now. So first and foremost, you can see I'm sharing my webcam. This is going to be a little bit of a different type of webinar that we've done in the past. First, we're sharing the webcam. We're trying to use our GoToWebinar tools more effectively. We also have a few links that are linked up from the toolbox as well. So throughout this presentation, we are going to have our presenters reference these links, and so you feel free to download them now, download them later. It's up to you, but our presenters will be referencing them. We'll try to flash them up on the screen throughout the presentations as well. So to kick things off, a lot of you have seen these slides in the past if you've attended any of our webinars before, but this webinar is being recorded. It's going to be available as early as next week, if not this week. So probably this week sometime at irrigation.org/webinar_series. So we'll have the recording of this webinar along with links to all the attachments that you see as well, and maybe some other links to some websites that are being referenced throughout these presentations as well. If you have a question, so this is going to be a panel format. For those of you who attended our ag presentation, a couple weeks ago, and for those of you who attended our water or drought summits in the past, this panel is going to be done a lot like that. So there's going to be a lot of interaction between myself as the moderator and our panelists, and a lot of interaction between the panelists as well. And we're going to solicit a lot of questions from you all as well. So if you have any questions from the audience, feel free to type them in. Hey Brent, if you could mute your phone, that would be very helpful. Thank you very much. So if you have any, perfect. If you have any questions, type it into the questions toolbox, and I will go ahead and moderate a Q&A period as well. I'm excited because this is our largest webinar we've had in a few years. 173 people have signed up for this webinar. So obviously, we have a lot of interest on landscape issues, a lot of interest in what our presenters have to say. And so I know a lot of you have a lot of questions for our experts. So I encourage you to type those in and hopefully have a running dialogue, again, between myself, the presenters, among the presenters themselves, etc. Also good news is that this is worth 1 CEU. So if you do hold an Irrigation Association certification, this is worth 1 CEU. If you are participating live, that's great. We can reference your participation automatically. It's being uploaded to our database. So if you are audited, we have reference that you attended this webinar live and you're good to go. If you're watching this via our YouTube page, please take reference to when you watched it. Take some screenshots throughout the presentation, save those, because then if you are audited, you can reference the fact that you watched this presentation on YouTube as well. So let's quickly talk about water use and why we're here, okay? So when I give a presentation about irrigation and water use throughout the United States, I start with this slide usually. And when people outside of our industry think about water use, if they're not involved in agriculture, they're not involved in landscape, they know what they know, and that's what's done in the bathroom. Okay, I'm not sure why a cat's in the bathroom there, but he is. And so they think of water use in the bathroom, maybe a kitchen as well, okay? But you know, you run a bath, you turn on the shower, you flush a toilet, you turn on a sink to wash your hands. For sanitation, for health purposes, you drink water. This is how people know water, okay? We view water differently. We view it like this, landscape irrigation, right? So if you don't have, people don't have an irrigation system, maybe they're driving by and so they'll only know what houses have irrigation, especially out east. Out west, it's more common. So you might know that you have an irrigation system or a lot of your neighbors have irrigation systems. But then you have golf irrigation as well. Okay, so if you don't play golf or you're not associated with golf, you don't know where golf course water comes from, how it's irrigated, but you maybe see this. So maybe if you do drive by a golf course, that's more likely to be irrigated than homes. Maybe you see them go off once in a while. So maybe that's your interpretation of irrigation as well. Unfortunately, the next slide is our reality and a lot of the hurdles that we have to overcome when talking about the benefits of what we grow and the benefits of irrigation, let alone the benefits of efficient irrigation. And that are these pictures here. So these are 3 common problems that we see throughout the United States. Whether you have irrigation running off on sidewalks, you have a broken sprinkler head that creates a form of a geyser coming out of the ground, or you have an irrigation system going off when it's raining, okay? This is not the norm. Maybe it's not as common as you think, but it does happen. And it's something that our industry needs to wrap our heads around and overcome these obstacles to create more of a better way to practice and promote efficient irrigation in the landscapes. However, like I said, we have 3 great panelists, and I don't want to talk a lot on the front end, kind of teeing things up, because there's a lot of great questions that I've produced here, and hopefully a lot of you will have questions as well. So what we're going to do now is introduce our panelists. Of course, I've already introduced myself. My name is John Farner of the Irrigation Association. These are all of our email addresses. We have Brent Meekum, also with the Irrigation Association. You heard him earlier in his phone. Carlos Michelin with the San Diego County Water Authority, and Brian Vincasey with Irrigation Consulting. So I'm just go ahead in alphabetical order. And Brent, if you want to take your phone off of mute, please. I'll give you a second to do that. Go ahead and introduce yourself, what your background is, what you currently do with the Irrigation Association. That'd be great. So Brent, take it away.
Thank you, John. So this is Brent Meekum. I'm with the Irrigation Association as the Industry Development Director and been there a little over 10 years already. And previous experience, I used to work for a large water agency in Colorado that supplied water to 32 municipalities and about 120 ditch companies for ag irrigation. And prior to that, I've actually had some experience doing landscape and irrigation contracting and working as a design build contractor in the Denver area primarily. And so I've had the privilege of being on both sides of the water equation, it seems like, and I've learned a lot in all the opportunities I've had to work over the last few years.
Great. Thank you, Brent. And we'll be hearing a lot from you as this presentation goes on, I'm sure. Next up, Carlos Michelin with San Diego County Water Authority. Carlos, want to introduce yourself real quick?
Great. Greetings from San Diego, California. So it's morning here. Good morning and good afternoon to those of you east of me. Yes, I serve as the Water Conservation Program Manager at the San Diego County Water Authority. My career in water resource management spans about 25 years plus. I previously worked at the Metropolitan Water District. For the past 10 years, going on 11 years, I've been here at the San Diego County Water Authority. And during my tenure in water, I've invested about a decade on statewide policy issues surrounding the Bay Delta. But most recently, and my passion is for water use efficiency. So I've worked very closely with the other gentlemen on the call over the years to advance initiatives here locally in collaboration with our 24 member agencies. We basically develop and implement regional water use efficiency programs that help customers in all sectors, agriculture, commercial, residential, save water, meet their needs while using water efficiently. So glad to join you.
Great, thanks, Carlos. I appreciate it. And last but certainly not least is our good friend Brian Vincasey. Brian, want to introduce yourself?
So I'm Brian Vincasey. I'm work for a small irrigation consulting company out of Boston. I'm a degreed agricultural engineer. I've been in the irrigation industry for 35 years. I've been a consultant for 30 years. I do a lot of commercial and golf course irrigation. I'm past president of the Irrigation Association, past president of the American Society of Irrigation Consultants, and since 2001, when it started, I am the Smart Water Applications Technology Chair for the IA, as well as their Standards and Codes Chair.
Perfect. And those last 2 points you got to, Brian, we're going to talk about at length. So keep that in front of mind. However, I want to stick with you, Brian, real fast, and so don't go anywhere. And I'm going to start. I opened this question up the same way in the ag webinar that we had a couple weeks ago. So I'm going to ask you the exact same question. what do you feel is the biggest issue or hurdle? Okay, so whichever one you want, that's facing the landscape irrigation industry today.
Well, I think it's a little geographic, but certainly where I am and in most of the country, it is regulation, which Brent will certainly talk to. But we find that regulation of irrigation is becoming more and more prolific, as well as more and more strict. Surprisingly enough, it is in the areas that have the most water, such as New England, that the irrigation regulation is the most strict, and in areas where there's the least water, Arizona, Southern California, irrigation regulation is less strict. And that's basically because in the West, in the dry areas, irrigation gets a lot more respect than it does in the wetter areas. Here, if there's any sense of a drought, irrigation is the first thing that gets cut off without any thought at all to the landscape or to the industries that are part of that or the employees that are part of that. We have some very stupid, I guess would be the best way to put it, rules and regulations. We have one here in Massachusetts that is you water 1 inch a week, 1 day a week. We don't have a soil in Massachusetts that would hold 1 inch of water, but still that's the rule. So I think regulation throughout the country is the biggest hurdle that we're going to face now and into the future.
You know, I put up a slide, Brian, when you were talking, and this is a fairly new slide. The United States Geologic Service does a water use in the United States survey every 5 years. The 2010 data came out in 2014. They are currently working on the 2015 data. They're hoping to get that out actually this year in 2018. But they've started to release a little bit of data here and there regarding water use in the United States. So while the whole report is not out, they are gradually releasing snippets of data that they found. And so you can see here, you mentioned states that use a lot of water versus not a lot of water. This is public supply withdrawals by state in 2010 and 2015. Now, with that said, this is not per capita, this is total. So those states that don't have a lot of people, i.e. Montana, you'll see it's very low. California, very high ag, very high population, there's going to be more water. So this is just, I thought, very interest reference. I know you talked about those states don't have a lot of irrigation versus states that do. We pretty much draw that east versus west for the most part. There's some differences here and there, but I thought I'd just kind of reference this as we're going through these presentations. So next up, so reverse order, Carlos. Same question for you. From your perspective, I know you're a little bit different being from a water provider, but a very close partner of the irrigation industry, so to speak. What do you feel is the biggest issue or hurdle facing the landscaping irrigation industry today?
Well, I'll start by agreeing with Brian. I mean, regulations across the board it's a very fluid environment. There's a lot of changes. Out here in California, for example, a couple of efforts that relate to regulations are the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, which helps us ensure that new construction, newly developed landscapes meet certain design parameters. And we're very involved in that, very supportive of that effort. Also, the state of California has a process underway to regulate irrigation components. So that's a very interesting new development that we're looking forward to seeing the outcomes to ensure that the marketplace has the best available technology and that is required. But really from my vantage point and the work we do to promote water use efficiency, there's a couple of key challenges that I'd like to bring forward. The first is, you know, we tend to relate to irrigation systems as only the mechanical system, meaning the controls, the distribution components that make the water flow. But it's inextricably linked to the landscape as an interdependent system. You know, what's the water being used for? It's being used for the plants. How efficiently that water is available to the plants depends a lot on the soils. So it's a little bit more involved than just understanding how the water flows. It's understanding what plants are appropriate for your climate, what are the best design practices to optimize water use efficiency overall. And to that end, we develop programs like our sustainable landscaping program that crosses over. You know, one of the cornerstones is efficient irrigation, but it brings into focus all these other important considerations. And then to supplement that view, you know, first we've just defined that landscaping is more than irrigation. And then the thing that goes with that is workforce development, that we need tools and resources to better prepare the great men and women who manage our landscapes every day. And to that end, we have programs like the Qualified Water Efficient Landscaper in collaboration with Sonoma County Water Authority that developed that is sort of a great starting point, you know, basic training for anybody who has hands-on with irrigation systems.
Very good.
If I can just add, and then just we are a longtime supporter of the IA's SWAT initiative, Smart Water Application Technologies, and I just wanted to interject that as this is a very important forum where water utilities get to interact with the irrigation industry and other green industry members to collectively advance these priorities and make sure that the solutions we develop are useful to all parties.
Yeah, I think the role of technologies is going to be very important, and SWAT plays a big role in that. So I don't want to again lose that thought, because I want to talk about that later on as well. However, I'll go back to Brent, and Brent, I will ask you the same question. And Carlos, you're not done yet. Just come back to you in a second. Brent, same question. What is the biggest issue or hurdle facing the landscape irrigation industry today?
The biggest, huh? Sometimes I think we are our own obstacle. And I mean by that is that things are changing really fast, and we've been very slow to respond in many cases. And so Carlos kind of brought up technology, and that's one of the challenges I see, is that there are some great new technologies that really can enhance like water management and make irrigation more efficient, and yet our workforce is slow to adopt it or has not fully embraced it and understood how to implement it. So I see that as a real challenge, and yet the marketplace is actually asking for more of it. The consumer seems to be aware of it and asking for it, and so that's been a challenge that we've been hearing about. The fact that the landscape industry in general right now, one of their biggest challenges is just finding anybody who wants to be involved in this industry to actually be the installer and to work with plants. So I see that as a challenge. And then we have an outside influence that's coming in the form of regulators who say, yes, landscapes are using a lot of water, so we need to create and draft regulations. And Brian kind of alluded to it. Sometimes they're stupid because they don't have a lot of science, but they have a lot of emotion behind it. And sometimes those get put into place, and then they're very hard to change. And so I just see both of those things kind of happening at the same time. And so the industry is struggling to really keep up. And so when I kind of look at all of it, it really comes around to how do we become sustainable in what we're doing, because that's really the request that's coming from regulators and from people who are forward thinking and saying we got to be better stewards of a precious resource.
I agree. Thank you, Brent. And stay. I'm gonna stick with you, Brent, because I'm gonna skip over some slides here. And I know you're not in front of a computer. You are actually on the road doing this webinar, which we greatly appreciate. But I have a slide up right now that says who is driving our future, the future, outside of the government. Okay. And I think you know where I'm going with this. And so you have groups like the United States Green Building Council, the LEAD program. You have Green Building Initiative, Sustainable Sites Initiative, IAPMO, ICC, and ASHRAE. So you have all these organizations in there that have some sort of say over the future of the landscape irrigation industry that work in, I don't want to call it a shadow government, but it's regulations, draft regulations being done not by elected officials. Elected officials then implement these regulations as code, as law, And so, but everything's done before it gets to that point. Can you talk a little bit about the role these organizations play in the future that the landscape irrigation industry, you know, what they have for our future, how they're driving our future?
Yeah, so I'll address that a little bit. I think most people within the landscape industry know that there are certain codes and regulations that we are going to comply with. Backflow devices, protecting the potable water supply. That's a code that's been in place, and it's to protect the interest of the public so that no harm comes to them. We deal with electrical code, not a lot of it, but there's a small part of electrical code we must comply with our controllers, the wiring in the field, again, to protect people. And so most building codes are about safety and protection of people. But there's this new kind of code and model ordinances and codes that come around that's looking at protecting the environment, and they get called green codes. So it's taken the basic codes of protection and safety and now extending it to how do we protect the environment. And so, there are a lot of things that can be done, and I think it's been interesting because people are familiar with the building code and how they're crafted, and every 3 years they're modified or renewed, etc. But with the green codes, they've now gone outside of the building envelope and now saying that we need to look at the site where this building's being located and what are we going to do to protect the environment and the site. And so it suddenly gets a little bit complicated because most building officials are comfortable about the building. They're uncomfortable about what is going on the site because it has mostly been under the jurisdiction of the planning and zoning commissions in a city or a county, not the building department. So we've seen this kind of a crossover of who has the authority. Is it planning and zoning, or is it going to be the building department over what is the landscape going to look like? And when they talk about the landscape, they're also including the irrigation system that's going to deliver water. So a lot of that has been going on. It's a pretty competitive space. The federal government embraces this because you have executive orders from the president. You have other agencies who are saying, no, we need to reduce water use by 20% by 2020, which is only a couple of years away now. The same thing with electricity, electrical use. How do we reduce that? Because in the end, I think we all are going to be better off if we can get exactly the same result with less inputs.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned 2020. For the first time, I was reading, they referenced 2030 instead of 2020 in terms of water use. I was like, yeah, it's about a year and a half away is 2020, so we got to change the mark a little bit. I want to stick with that, Brent, and I want to include all the panelists here because I want to get into standards. And when we talk about standards, we talk a little bit about what SWAT has done. And I also want to reference what Carlos talked about there, and that is California looking to regulate irrigation components. And what we have found is what starts in California sometimes blows east with the weather. So what happens in California doesn't necessarily stay in California. So that's why it not only is important to our industry, it's important in terms of policy as well, because it can be replicated throughout. So I'm going to start with this question, and I'll start with Brent, and I'll move on to Brian and Carlos as well. Brent, can you kind of give a lay of the land, because you've been involved in this heavily. What is California looking to do in terms of regulating irrigation components to meet a specification set by the state itself, and how that compares to what's being done in the national level, either with SWAT or through WaterSense or through the standard setting process that the Irrigation Association has been a part of?
So the standards are kind of an interesting thing. Typically, standards are created on a voluntary basis, that this will be the best or preferred way that something gets done, and people are then free to adopt that. However, if you have a regulator or a code entity who says, we're going to use that standard that was voluntary and now turn it into something mandatory. So that's been actually kind of going on in California for a while. They have their California, what they call Cal Green, which is their green building code. and for years had in there as an option the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance. However, it's no longer a model. I'm suggesting that maybe M has now changed to mandatory because it's now in the building code that all new construction will be following this water budget approach to creating the landscape and how much water will be available. So now that's into the building code. That means it's going to be revisited every 3 years by state statute that has to go on. So they've been doing that. And yes, I've been very involved in some aspects of working with the Department of Water Resources and identifying perhaps enhancements or changes to that model ordinance that, will become more permanent with time. Then going on, as Carlos alluded, they have the California Energy Commission. Ironically, I've been very involved with them in the last year as they are looking at crafting regulations that will have essentially the same power as the governor signing something into law. And they're looking at things that will save energy and water. And one of the things that they are focused on right now are pressure regulating sprinklers. And I was at a meeting about 2 weeks ago in Sacramento where they've outlined their process, their logic, everything that they're going to do. There's no doubt in my mind that they're going to make a regulation about it, but they are trying to make sure that they get plenty of public input before they put that. But essentially it's saying 2020, January 1st, 2020, the only sprinkler that you'll be able to install in California as a spray body would be pressure regulated. And so that is good news, bad news, because maybe for the manufacturers, they'll say, yay, we're finally getting products that we've been making for years to be now mandated. But there's some cons to it in the fact that, if you don't have excessive pressure, why do I have to put in a pressure regulating sprinkler? And so those are the kinds of questions that they're wrestling with right now, is to say, can they justify why they do that? But all the numbers that I've been seeing says the payoff is going to be terrific, and everybody's saying they're too conservative in their estimates. So I'm pretty sure that they're looking at it, and it's the amount of energy that they'll save because they're not delivering as much water, and then there's the water, all the energy just embedded in water. So it's pretty much a win-win in California for them to do that.
Hey, Brian, like you mentioned, you've been involved in SWAT, Smart Water Application Technologies, and the website there is SWATirrigation.org, and we'll put a link to that up when we link up this presentation as well on the IA website. But what drove the creation of SWAT was the ability to create a testing protocol that can put everyone in the same playing field, so to speak, to see how technologies, if they could achieve what they claimed they were able to achieve. And are you concerned with states like California that are going off and setting their own standards and their own specifications on what different technologies, how they need to perform vis-a-vis other states or even a national standard setting process? Is that of concern to you, or is that something you've seen elsewhere?
Well, I don't think it's a huge concern. We as SWAT, we have been doing this for a long time now, about 16 years. And we started out trying to, knowing that there was a labeling program coming along, and we wanted to provide a testing protocol and a test that showed people whether a product does what it says it does, basically. And we started with smart controllers, which was probably a big mistake because it took forever to do. But that ended up being the EPA WaterSense labeling program. The basis for that is the SWAT protocol for that. The pressure regulating one, SWAT has had a lot of influence on that also. It will on the soil moisture. But what we've done at SWAT here lately is we've kind of changed our focus to not do any more reporting or testing and to just write standards and protocols that help EPA come up with their labeling program and what's the test for that, because they like that stuff to come from industry. The California thing, is interesting. We've had a lot of input, as Brent said, on that. And I think the more we can get the product to do what it's supposed to do, and the more entities that we can get to make that product do what it's supposed to do, that saves water so we can get more people to use it. I mean, pressure regulating sprays have been around forever, but if you ask a manufacturer, they don't sell very many. So I'm not as concerned with them in a competition standpoint as much as I am with a collective effort to get the technology into the market, where if the manufacturer sells more, they can develop more. It's just good for the industry. The less water we can use, the better. And SWAT is positioned to help all of those entities do that. I think you find in the long run, even though they may sound like one organization's competing against another, when you break it down, they're not all that far apart. And then most of them are asking for basically the same thing with a little nuances on how each one does it a little differently.
Yeah, when I think about it, and what kind of concerns me, and maybe any of you guys can react to this, is when you think of California and you think of regulations that are different than the rest of the United States, you think of things like car emissions and the different standards and protocols that car manufacturers need to go through to sell cars in California versus the rest of the United States. And I just wanted to see where if that analogy or the comparison was fair or not fair to what we're seeing now with pressure regulated sprinklers and potentially more in the future in California. I don't know if any of you guys can react to that or not.
Yeah, let me jump in on that. This is Carlos in San Diego.
Yeah.
If we just look at the paradigm of water efficiency, we might be missing the picture. Water is kind of this universal thing, and stormwater management is a huge national issue that every jurisdiction, coast to coast, has to face. And there are strong teeth related to the Clean Water Act associated with those regulations. So this phenomenon of runoff from irrigation systems, and thank you for your slides earlier where you illustrated some extreme examples. Unfortunately, that's reality. It's not unique to California. It's everywhere. That exists in places. And the spirit of these regulations on the marketplace to try to identify which products are going to minimize these problems, I think rather than write it off as like a stupid regulation, we need to embrace it and acknowledge, okay, these are physical issues in the systems that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, and let's take advantage of those technologies that are safeguards to minimizing and containing these problems. But the toughest thing to regulate is the human element. There are individuals involved in the design and installation of these systems. And we want to invest in that workforce development to make sure that they're prepared to manage and install these systems appropriately. And that's our best safeguard against this. But from my standpoint, I embrace those regulations. I don't think they're unique to California. I think it's something that all states will be looking at. We're just dealing with it sooner.
And I want to stick with you, Carlos, because in your opening remarks, you mentioned a holistic approach. And I want to get into plant material here, because I think a lot of the regulation we're seeing is not only on technologies, access to water, and those type of regulations there, but we're seeing a lot on plant material, the kind of plants that are installed in different landscapes. And as you mentioned, stormwater is a huge factor. Out east, out west, that is universal throughout the United States, is managing stormwater, making sure water goes from point A to point B, using landscape plant material. And you have your sustainable landscape program in San Diego. So do you want to briefly talk about that program specifically and how it treats plant material alongside irrigation, what I call irrigation efficiency and technologies?
Gladly, yeah, thank you. So, instead of just maximizing the efficiency of one resource, we're trying to optimize multiple resources. So there's these different problems. From the water efficiency standpoint, we're trying to make sure we use the least amount of water that's appropriate and necessary to sustain the landscape. We've mentioned the stormwater picture that, rainfall, when it occurs, it's going to happen in a way that our current systems shunt that water, in our coastal environment down the storm drain and ultimately into our beaches, and it results in beach closures. So there's pollution that runoff is carrying with it. And a better approach is to try to retain some of that on site. It's designed to be compatible with the regulations for stormwater. So and then there's what we know so well, that plants and irrigation components are what we typically pay attention to. But what really goes overlooked a lot is the most foundational piece of all, soils. Healthy soils are the starting point for everything. So yes, our program encapsulates these different dimensions: soil, stormwater, water efficiency, and through irrigation components, and then an appropriate plant palette. And we tend to not regulate the plant palette directly. We want to maximize freedom of design. We seek climate appropriate plants. They tend to be low to moderate water using plants. But if you follow a water budgeting methodology, these equations basically hardwire for you some limits. And you can, we're advocates for you choosing how you use your water budget to support the functional and recreational needs. In its current form right now, you're seeing most of the emphasis go toward these climate appropriate plants exclusively, featuring like some feature like stormwater detention. We're trying to promote bioswales increasingly. It doesn't have to be like rock area to detain the water. So I know I'm describing with words things that lend themselves more to seeing pictures. But stepping back from it, what we've managed to do is marry up basically a methodology that addresses both water efficiency and stormwater management in a way that we've demonstrated through hundreds of participants in our voluntary program, that it has curb appeal and people are coming to it. They're seeing the opportunity to do something sustainable and upgrade from their present landscapes.
Is this strictly voluntary right now? Are you incentivizing participation in this at all right now?
Yeah, it's voluntary, and we provide $1.75 a square foot at present, up to, we allow 3,000 square feet of maximum participation area. Presently, we only provide that to residential customers. We hope to expand that to commercial landscapes as well in the near future.
Okay, good. Brent, let's go back to you. So Carlos mentioned water budgeting, which is something I know that the Irrigation Association has been a proponent of for some time now. Ever since I've been at the IA, I joined just after you did, even a lot longer than I have. What do you see the role of plant material in this whole thing? Because you're involved in a lot of these discussions, and a lot of it, and I've not been one to shy away from this discussion, it revolves around turf grass, not just low, medium, high water use plant material, but a specific focus on turf grass. So what do you see is the current focus right now on plant material and turf grass versus solely irrigation technologies? It's a loaded question.
It's a loaded question, yeah. So it always comes down really right plant for the right place and right purpose. And too often, I think perhaps turf grass has been used over the years and maybe inappropriate places just because it's the least expensive ground cover there is. And so often it was put in, with no thought about, the long-term management, maintenance, or maybe perhaps impact. And the impact tends to be about, well, what's the long-term maintenance strategy? And so a lot of people, especially those who are very sensitive about the environment, look at the inputs of mowing or fertilizer or chemicals and stuff to have this pristine lawn. And so it tends to get this attack upon it, even though the plant itself can be very drought hardy. It's maybe sometimes just put in the wrong place. I'm sitting in a parking lot right now and saying, why do we have an island of grass here that's surrounded by asphalt And, you know, and it's a very odd shape, so it's easy to cover the ground, but, you know, it's not serving any practical purpose. So I think what we're seeing is a shift, and the landscape architects, I think, have been at the forefront of this, is to perhaps look at trying to use more native type plants in a site. And and I don't have anything against that, but so often by the time we get done building the building, there's nothing native about the site. You know, that we're asking these native plants that have evolved over the eons to now take on a new role in a situation where now we've got all kinds of microclimates created because of the building that the plants never had to deal with. And so I think it's trying to choose appropriate plants, ones that, as Carlos kind of described it, that need minimal input, but they cannot be neglected. And I think there's a big difference there, that irrigation becomes a part of this in the fact that if the plants are thriving and doing well, then a lot of the benefits that we derive from the plants can actually come to pass. The cooling effect, if they're robust, they'll, you know, withstand drought and stuff like that for periods of time. So all of that is actually trying to be written into a lot of these model codes now to be more prescriptive about, well, what kind of plants can you use? And I think the reality is we need to empower the real professionals who have studied this and understand it, that they can make a good decision that's appropriate for a building and a building project. So it is a very complicated thing. And, you know, at the same token, you know, it's really hard to enjoy a great game of kickball or soccer or anything like that if you're not playing it on grass. And so I really think we're kind of, as a society, needing to evolve and understand that turf has a great place, and let's put it where it's most useful and needed. And other plants might fit a situation better, you know, and I'm looking at one right now where I could say, yeah, there's a lot of things I could have put there, but they'd all cost more money initially to install, but long term probably would take less maintenance. And so I think a lot of times we're dealing with the initial cost versus the long-term investment, and balancing that out.
Brian, when you first opened up your remarks to answer my question, you mentioned how you found that a lot of the areas where you work on the East Coast, a lot more draconian regulations as compared to those that have a lot more water availability issues facing them. And I think you attributed that to the fact that, I'll put words in your mouth here, but the landscape industry is kind of the Rodney Dangerfield of industries. It really doesn't get respect like it deserves from these kind of regulators. That, in my opinion, that's one of the biggest challenges facing our industry, and it's a challenge that faces not only the irrigation industry, but also the landscape industry as a whole. And that is the value placed on what we're growing, because you and I can argue efficient irrigation all day long, but when a regulator thinks that every single drop of water placed on a landscape is a waste, then our argument for efficiency goes out the window. So I'll look to you, and you pose that issue as a problem. What do you think are the biggest opportunities for the landscape industry to have here to overcome that hurdle? Because like I said, it's one that I think is of utmost importance to our future.
Well, I think education is the key. You have to educate people on why the landscape is important and why maintaining the landscape with water is important, and what the environmental benefits of that is, oxygen producing, all of that stuff that we can go through. But I think you can also educate them in that some regulation makes sense. For instance, Massachusetts has just finally started to implement, through some guidelines, a rain shutoff requirement, which was actually passed by the legislature 4 years ago. And it's only now coming to fruition. And there's still not very many states that do not have rain shutoff regulation, which is kind of stupid. And as Carlos, so we can go Carlos stupid both ways, from the regulator and not the regulator. But pressure regulating sprinklers make sense. If you're not running the sprinkler at the pressure it's intended to run, you're going to waste water. You're going to have more runoff. Smart controllers make sense. So I guess my point with regulation would be, before you just kill it, look at the technology, look at what's out there to save water. So you have to educate the stakeholders, and you have to educate the regulators on the good and bad parts of the industry and what they can do. So one of the things we always do is, we have all this great equipment out there, but we also have no barrier to being an irrigation contractor. So anybody can be an
Yeah.
irrigation contractor. You don't need any education. Well, that may not be a good thing. And some people may think it is a good thing, others may think it's not a good thing. But if the contractor is not educated, it doesn't matter how good the design is. It doesn't matter how good the equipment is. Because if the contractor doesn't know how to use the technology, which is a big problem with some of the technology, the contractor doesn't like to use it because it takes a learning curve and takes a little more work on their part. So all of those things enter into it. So education's the key, from the contractor to the distributor to the regulator to the property owner. It all has to come together.
I agree. And so I'm gonna pause there for a second and say, I know that there are some questions that have been popping up on the screen. I'm going to get to those in a second. I'm going to have one more question for the panel, and then I'm going to go back to the questions that have been posed via the toolbar. So if you have any questions regarding anything we discussed, or anything you want to hear we haven't discussed yet, please get them in. We have about 15 minutes left in our webinar. I'll make sure to get to these questions through rapid fire. But workforce is something that has been constant throughout our discussions right now. And I'm going to compartmentalize workforce into two categories and then engage each one of you on those compartments. One is, there is just a need for workers, period. I think, Brent, you mentioned it, where we need worker bees to do the work. You need folks that are digging holes. You need folks that are gluing pipe. You need folks that are installing, up to running irrigation businesses, up to folks working for manufacturers. There is a workforce need throughout the industry that is significant. And it's not unique to irrigation by any stretch of the imagination, but it is significant within our industry. So that's one. The second one is the part where you hit home, Brian, just now, and that is a qualified workforce to do the job and do the job right. And I know, Carlos, that is one of the, not frustrations, one of the focuses that you've had as well throughout, you and I have been working together and become friends, talking about this need on folks that understand it and do it well. When I first started with irrigation, one of the things that I saw is that our industry does not give itself enough respect for what it does, where the good irrigation contractors, the knowledgeable ones, the good designers, the good consultants, they are very proficient at math. And there's a lot of math in our industry. It is not just, seeing where water needs to go with a sprinkler. It is fully designing and installing both and auditing, all of which need a lot of math. So with all of that said, there are two things I want to focus on here. One is certification. The other is licensing. Okay, I'm going to start with Carlos, then Brent, then Brian. Okay, so Carlos, you mentioned the Qualified Water Efficient Landscaper program that I know you've been involved in. You've also been involved with the IA side as well. We have certifications from technician, contractor, designer, to auditor for landscape and golf. So what is your opinion on how to ensure that our workforce on the landscape irrigation side is knowledgeable and ready to do the job that needs to be done in your service area? Is licensing the answer, or is it the continued promotion of these kind of certifications?
Well, thank you. It's a tough question. I mean, you resorted to compartmentalizing, which is a good strategy to keep it manageable. But think about the life cycle of a landscape. There are people who design it. They're not necessarily the same people who install it. Who are not necessarily the same people who maintain it. And there's a lot of turnover in this industry. So, I think certification, credentialing, I'm going to call it more generically, because there's private sector certificates, there's state mandated licenses. And so some mix of all of the above is a necessary tool, an appropriate resource to really try to recognize and call upon qualified professionals. So it's a tough challenge. I think it begins from a place of understanding everybody's role in the marketplace as having a common stewardship responsibility. All right. And you know, the mechanics of how do you administer something, you know, a license or a certificate is not a guarantee that a site is going to be properly designed or managed. So let's look beyond just the certification step. My answer is going to be, I want to strongly support, you know, upgrading the requirements for licensure, you know, trying to possibly require where necessary, where other attempted solutions have failed, some type of certification, so the people who have boots on the ground and have a certain responsibility, you know, are properly trained and vetted. And the flip side of that, I want to see a lot more market recognition for those who attain those high standards. And that's something where we have a role to play, where through our Water Smart promotions and so forth, we try to put the spotlight on the best practitioners who meet these standards.
Brent, what do you think about that original question?
So I think it's a little bit complicated in the fact that licensing typically is about a company and their ability to do business and to conduct business practices, sign contracts and stuff. And certification typically is about the individual. And so many places I think you could use both. And I think the really good companies understand the value of certified individuals, and they will recognize them with either higher paycheck, or they find some way to keep these people who know not only how to do the job, but why you do it. And I think that's one of the things about certification. It's not only how, but an understanding of why you do certain things. Hydraulics, for example, why we only do 5 feet per second, stuff like that. So I think there's probably room in the marketplace for both. Most states, I think licensing is like, well, if we do that, then that means we have to enforce it, and that takes more, you know, money and people and stuff like that. And so they're hesitant to jump on board with that. And it's still no guarantee that, you know, you're going to get a great result. But at least they're bonded, or they're insured, and they're protecting the public with a licensing approach. And we still say certification is we think these people are capable of doing the job correctly, but we don't have any way to guarantee that they'll do that. I have heard Jonah Shine from EPA WaterSense program, who says it's really hard for them to quantify it, but they absolutely know that certified individuals actually help save water because they do the irrigation better. And so while they would love to be able to put a hard number to it, they can't, but he's very convinced that those professional type people are actually part of the solution in reducing the outdoor water usage.
Well, you know, I have a response to that, in that you flush a toilet once, it uses X amount of water. A more efficient toilet will use a little bit less water than, you know, 20% less, according to EPA WaterSense standards. But irrigation is a lot different. There's a lot of factors involved in that. And as you know, Brent, I think that's why you have reactions like that, that you can't quantify it, but you just know that there's a lot more intricacies involved in a landscape irrigation system than an installed toilet or installed shower head in the bathroom. So, Brian, same question. And one of the word choices you used really piqued my interest, and that was barrier to entry. A few years ago, there was a big focus in North Carolina on the licensing in North Carolina actually going away because it was seen as a barrier to entry to become a landscape irrigation contractor. And so we're seeing a lot of deregulation occur throughout the United States. But yet engineers, which you are by training, they have a full board, and there's no question at all that they need to be licensed, et cetera. And it all comes down to public safety. So I agree with you in that we need to have qualified individuals doing the work. But what are your thoughts? I mean, you and Brent have a lot of alphabet soup behind your name in terms of certifications. Right. What is your opinion on the certifications versus licensing?
Well, you can tell I'm a big fan of credentialing, not only for myself, but my employees. And I also like it for the people we do business with, because I think it shows a competency And, you know, I'm an engineer, which some people would say that's all you need to be, therefore you're qualified, but I like to be credentialed because it shows that I also know about irrigation. But I look at it a little differently in two ways. One is, if you are credentialed, you usually have some sort of CEU requirement. And by having a CEU requirement, you have to stay up with what's going on. You have to go out and learn, at least on a yearly or a couple yearly basis, what's going on out there, so you get to understand new technology, whether you're using it or not. But from my perspective as a consultant, I go out and I look at a lot of work, and that work may be installed well or it may be installed poorly. And if you're credentialed, if you're licensed or you're certified, I know that you know what you're doing. And if I go out there and I see that it's not installed properly and you're credentialed, I know that you did it on purpose, as opposed to someone who just doesn't know the right way to do it. And to me, that's a big factor. I can, in all honesty, jump on somebody who's credentialed for doing something wrong much harder than I can go on somebody who may just not know the right way to do it. And I think that's credentialing helps you in that way. And I think if you're using water, which is a precious resource, having credentials for the people who have the potential to use it correctly or incorrectly is important. In Massachusetts, they hate licensing and anything that has to do with this. They've been trying to kill them all, but we have a licensing bill that has a lot of effort behind it from the regulators and the industry, for just that reason, is to try and bring up our image of doing good work and using water efficiently.
So we have 3 minutes left. There are some questions that were asked. I'm going to go ahead and take these questions and send them to the panel after we're finished here to make sure these are answered, because I don't want them to go unanswered. But I do have one more question for the panel that I think we can end with. And I'll start with, let's go in the original order. So it's Brent, then Carlos, then Brian. What do you think is the biggest opportunity for the landscape irrigation industry that's ahead of us?
I think the biggest opportunity is really to become really professional and know exactly what you're doing. And I think the way the marketplace is shifting and stuff, you will be rewarded because you understand and know what you're doing. And so I think the idea of education and certification, and you're doing it for yourself, it will be rewarded. And I think the marketplace is going to start demanding it.
Good. Carlos, same question. What's the biggest opportunity ahead?
Well, I think it's integration. I talked about the spirit of stewardship when it comes to managing landscapes. And I talked about how there's other considerations beyond just irrigation components. And I think the opportunity is in trying to integrate with other practitioners or master those skills so that, you know, the products and services are presented in a more holistic approach. So we're providing integrated solutions, and our practitioners are well versed in matters beyond just one specialty.
And Brian, what is your feeling? What is the biggest opportunity ahead for the industry?
Well, I'd agree with both of them, and I'd say you can help do that with technology. I think technology helps you educate. I think technology helps you realize that it's a group effort, that it's a holistic approach. Just for instance, if you have YouTube now, if you don't know how to install something, you go to YouTube and there's a video there that shows you how to install that piece of irrigation equipment. Where before, you'd have to ask somebody, and if that person wasn't there, you didn't have anybody else, you just took a guess. So I think those things plus technology to help you do it.
Well, listen, guys, thank you very much. I really appreciate your input. Hopefully this was a great and rewarding conversation for those who participated. Those who ask questions, I'm going to download those. We'll give them to the presenters, and you have everyone's email addresses. We'll try to get some responses out to you guys. Maybe even have a part 2 to this webinar later on. We'll see. We'll see what the interest is for these folks. Maybe get some newer faces in here and there as we go throughout. You'll see on these future webinars, we have 2 more webinars coming up here in the next couple of weeks. One is on April 5th, It's about moving water, the great infrastructure challenge, with our good friend Dan Kemp and the Family Farm Alliance and Laura Ziemer at Tron Unlimited. It's going to be focused a lot on ag irrigation, rural water infrastructure, but very interesting overall. And then the last one, right now it's scheduled for April 12th. That date, unfortunately, needs to change. We will let everyone know what the future date will be, but it will happen soon. It's a good friend, Amy Graham, with Texas Nursery and Landscape Association, and talk about a challenge. They were faced with significant drought a few years ago in Texas, and basically were threatened with all water being turned off to their landscapes, and developed a great program called Texas Water Smart. She's going to go through what the industry faced and how they responded and how that effort's continuing today. So with that said, Brian, Brent, and Carlos, that was great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. For everyone else, hope to see you on a future webinar. And make sure you download the handouts if you haven't done so. Or if you haven't done so, we'll link them up at irrigation.org/webinar_series. We're going to post this recording. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.